Now there's an idea, Robbie said, grinning. Nobody's ever done another Casablanca. Chapter 42. Once and for all. There was a birthday cake.
Anyone in the building?
There was a birthday cake for Mike at the center. It had his name on the top in bright red icing. He was surprised. Everyone had come to the cafeteria. The nurses and therapists and residence physician Dr. Ryan, the patients, even the nurses and aides from the night shift. He blew out the candles and everyone sang happy birthday. The senior nurse, Marion Chadwick, made a speech thanking him for the fine work he was doing at the center and presented him with flowers and a gift certificate amid cheers and applause. Mike felt himself blush a deeper and hotter red than that of the cake icing. Later at home, he picked up his father's photograph and pretended it was speaking to him. Fine work, Michael. Well done, son. Way to go. He waited patiently for the trial to begin to prove Dorfman's guilt once and for all. His name was Greg Stevenson, and he flew a 2-place ultralight. His partner had failed to turn up for a day's flying, so when he saw Mike standing watching the flyers through a pair of binoculars, he strolled over. You are usually in a wheelchair, ain't that right? I've seen you here lots of times. That's right, said Mike. Well, you're walking now. Great. Mike grinned self-consciously and demonstrated by walking back and forth a few places. This is my aunt, Norma McLeod, and my friend Robbie. Hi, Greg Stevenson. Pleased to meet you. He stuck out his hand, then he turned back to Mike. You ever fly one of these? He jerked his head at the ultralight. Mike knew it was a Beaver RX 550 Plus. Greg's was red, with what he knew looked like a big Rotex engine, a 582 maybe. Never, he said. He didn't like to mention that he had never been up in a plane, period. I was wondering if you'd like to take a short spin? Mike looked at his aunt. She shrugged and smiled. I'd like that, said Mike, trying to hide his excitement. I can't find you something warm. Make sure you don't freeze to death. He followed Greg over to the aircraft, pulled on a flying suit, and climbed, with help, into the back seat, his heart pounding with anticipation and excitement. And he flew. For the first time in his life, he flew. It was as simple and wonderful as that. It was time. A thick fog crouched over False Creek. The city was muffled in gloom. They took the small 12-passenger Aquabus ferry to the invisible Beach Avenue, and Robbie pushed Mike uphill. The journey was too much of a challenge for his tin legs. Along House Street, through half-blind traffic. They were dressed warmly. Mike and Robbie wore their baseball caps, and Norma a toque and walking shoes as she carried her umbrella. The fog was thinner in the downtown at the crest of the hill. They were early, so they walked to Robson Square to watch a peaceful demonstration in progress. About 100 people outside the art gallery with signs and billboards protesting what they believed to be the Algerian government's complicity and cover-up of 100,000 murders. And across the street, an old man paced up and down, carrying a sign above his head. The end is near. The traffic was noisy. The courtroom was crowded, but Detective Inspector Sampson was there, and he made space for them near the front. Mr. Dorfman sat at a table with his back near the court. All Mike could see of him was the back of his head. They were there all day listening to the evidence. There were no demonstrators in the square on the second day, except for the old man shuffling up and down outside the courthouse with a sign, "The end is near." On the third day, the fog was thicker, and the old man with the sign wasn't there. On the sixth day, Mike, Robbie, and Norma sat where they could see Dorfman more clearly. He looked wooden and passive. The case wound down. On the ninth day, the judge instructed the jury, and they retired to consider the verdict. On the 10th day, the fog had gone, and the old man with the sign was back, and the jury reached its verdict. Albert Dorfman, guilty of murder in the first degree. Mike could see Dorfman's face as the jury foreman read the verdict. Dorfman showed no emotion. Dark blue suit, blue shirt, red tie, wet lips, bald head, pale eyes. Nor did he show emotion as Judge John B. Watterson sentenced him to life imprisonment with no chance of parole. Chapter 43, One Last Time. Because it was a busy summer for Mike and Robbie, they saw less of each other. When they did get together, they had much to talk about. Robbie with stories of the furniture warehouse and the people who worked there, and Mike with his tales of the rehab center. Norma spent 2 weeks summer holidays simply relaxing around the apartment, visiting with the neighbors, reading, listening to the radio, watching the TV in the evenings as she surfed the channels, hunting for political news, gossip, and disaster stories, and talking to her friends in the co-op about August global tragedies, forest wildfires, the worst in 50 years, a terrorist bomb killing 8 in a Moscow subway tunnel close to the Kremlin, Basque separates killing more innocent people with car bombs, the tragic deaths of 118 men in Kursk, the Russian submarine. Norma had lots to talk about. Dolly Dollywall came over one evening with her box of tricks and gave Norma the full treatment over herb tea and sticky cakes. Mike had tea and cake and asked Dolly to read his palm. She told him he would suffer a loss, and this time he believed her. Then suddenly it was the end of September and the summer was over. He was wrong when he'd guessed he would never see Sarah again, for she came on a foggy October evening when the False Creek sea wall was as cold and deserted. After a full day at the center, he walked the short distance to Stamp's Landing through the fog and watched ghostly shapes of ships moving up the creek towards Granville Bridge. He listened, but could hear nothing. Vancouver was muffled, almost silent. The silence was welcome after the noise and bustle of the rehab center. He wore dark corduroys over his tin legs. He wore his rain jacket but no hat. His feet felt wet. He grinned wryly. He thought about Sarah. He was always thinking about Sarah, it seemed. And Becky, of course. He could never forget his sister or mom or dad. They were still a powerful ache in his heart. His home and family gone, Sarah gone, but his life had meaning now. He had a job, helping others like himself, and he was walking. He was happy, happier than he had been in a long time. Sounds began to filter in, the cry of a gull, the faint slap of water against the boat hulls in the marina, the tinkling bells, the fading roar of a bus over the Canby Bridge. He felt the air sliding and shifting about him, and the fog swirling and lifting with a rush, and her warm hands were suddenly on his face. The voice came from behind, a calm whisper in his ear. "I'm here, Michael." "Sarah!" She moved in front of him. Under a loose gray raincoat, she wore a plain gray dress that matched her eyes, her grayness merging with the fog. He blinked his eyes to be sure she was really there. It was Sarah, all right, but the same Sarah, but with a different aura about her. Not smiling as usual, but with a sadness, a kind of still quietness that made her almost a stranger. "Michael, my brave knight, I am so happy to see you, and look at you. Standing tall, I'm proud of you." He felt his throat tighten. It feels good to stand. And to look at you. Your tin legs. The fog swirled about them. "After grad, I didn't think I would ever see you again, Sarah. It was a feeling, and then I thought, no, she will come to say goodbye." She turned her head away and looked towards the city lights barely visible through the fog. "It's true, isn't it? You've come to say goodbye." She turned back to him, her eyes suddenly bright with tears. "Not goodbye, Michael." She took his hand in hers. "Goodbye is forever." "So I will see you again?" "Not for a very long time, but you kept your promise. You waited. Now it's my turn." He wanted to ask her what she meant, but he couldn't speak. All she knew was that he didn't want her to leave. They walked a short distance, holding hands, and sat together on a bench. I miss you, Sarah, and I miss the archives room and our talks. I keep remembering when you were just an 8th grade kid. Only months ago. Yet 100 years seem to have passed since then. Yes, I came to help you. You have helped me more than I can ever say. You called me a nuisance. No, I didn't. She smiled. Yes, you did. Didn't. You said I smelled like a bubblegum factory. and I smelled like, what was it? A pepperoni pizza, she laughed. You are such an old sourpuss. Do you remember what I said when I looked like Harrison Ford with that same scowl? You still look like him, you know, those eyes, and those hurt lines in your face. But you're happy now. Your life is good. Yes, she whispered. I'm leaving you now, Michael. She pulled away, but he held onto her hands, not letting go. What will happen to you, Sarah? Where will you? She placed a finger on his lips. The rain splattered in the puddles. The faint glow of the light from apartments and the high office towers across an inlet twinkled through the mist. The mournful cry of Prospect Point foghorn came up the inlet. He could feel the weight of the fog on his shoulders. He released her hands and hugged her. She was solid in his arms and warm. After a while, she freed herself and backed away from him, and when she was far away, waved, and he tried to wave back, but his arms suddenly had no lift in them. When she was so far away that he could barely see her face, she waved one last time. Then she merged with the gray landscape and the swirling mist. The seawall was empty. For a long time he stood, staring into the darkness and at the spot where she had disappeared. Then he walked along the back seawall and headed for home.